So let's start out. I don't like to make assumptions, and I think people hear diversity a lot, and now hearing more on DEI, the equity and inclusion part. So I guess help us to define what diversity, equity, and inclusion means. And then I think really, why is it so important?
Ginnette, do you want to go, or you want me to take it first?
Yeah, happy to kind of start. And yeah, thanks so much for having me, and really happy to be here, Scott, and happy to be sharing the virtual stage with you, Erin, too. So diversity, equity, and inclusion. I actually saw something that really summed that up quite nicely the other day. Diversity is facts, equity is choice, inclusion is an action, and belonging is an outcome. For me, I think that it's interesting now that we see diversity and inclusion kind of used so interchangeably, and there is a really clear sort of difference between the two. So I think when we're talking about diversity, we're talking about representation. And now that representation is covering such a huge spectrum, right? So we're talking about everything from race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, social class, physical ability and attributes, and kind of on and on. I was actually reading a post this morning where someone sort of said, it was acceptable for organizations, I think sort of 5 years ago, to say, we're just going to look at this through the lens of gender and we'll get to all the other stuff later. That is not acceptable now. Like, there are a number of different sort of elements that should be and are being sort of addressed. So I think it's important, first of all, to clarify that when we're talking about diversity, we're talking about representation. Equity is about fairness, and inclusion is really about honoring those differences. So it is about creating a climate where absolutely everyone can bring their true self to work. And I think where you'll sort of kind of get this almost kind of confusion is, okay, well, we've got representation, like we've got people who kind of look different, but how comfortable do they feel to be able to bring their true selves to work, to kind of show their differences? And is really kind of comes down to, on an organizational level, do we value that uniqueness, and have we created a space in which you can, kind of express that and bring it to the table? I think a lot of organizations feel more comfortable talking about diversity because it's been the conversation for sort of longer, and it's easier to measure. Like, I mean, we're all probably quite goal-driven people, and when you can kind of have that clear line of sight, how many African-American people have we hired? How many women are in leadership? Like, it's clear, you know where you are, you can set clear goals. Whereas with inclusion, I heard this described as trying to nail Jello to the wall, which makes a ton of sense to me, right? Because it's more nuanced, it's so much more complex to sort of understand. There's so many more factors to really understand the true nature and the true level of inclusion within your organization. And the good news is, I think there's tons of companies that are doing this really well, but I think it does take more commitment and more of a willingness for organizations to actually take that conversation from diversity and move it firmly into equity and kind of inclusion.
Yep.
And I'll probably kick it over to you, Erin, for the second part of Scott's question around why it's important.
I think, go ahead, Scott.
I do think that's such a big part that's missing, is I think people talk about it because they feel like they need to talk about it, but you have to take action. And I think one of the things that prevents people from taking action is they don't understand the importance.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great definition. And I would say that diversity is the easy part. And it's kind of the part that people think they've checked the box and they've done what they need to do. Equity and inclusion is the really hard part in many ways, to the point of nailing Jello to the wall. And it really requires that we question the norms, values, and practices that we have in place within our organizations and in our society. And that's difficult because, number one, it's uncomfortable and nobody likes to have uncomfortable conversations. And I'm an HR person, so I know that managers hate having uncomfortable conversations about performance, let alone about something as deeply personal as equity and inclusion. It also requires us to really examine our own privilege and how we benefit from the status quo. And we all benefit from it somehow, whether it's because you've gotten opportunities or as little as like, I have a pretty good thing going and I don't want to rock the boat. So it's easier for me to just let things go. So people want to do that. And then it's really about power. And it's very easy to say that I believe in this. And of course, I believe everyone should be treated the same, but I don't want to actually give up any of my power. And there's that quote by Franklin Leonard that says, when you're used to privilege, then equity can seem like oppression. And so I think that a lot of times people aren't really willing to do the things that they need to do to take the next step, because it really requires us to examine our own practices deeply and question some of our motivations and the things that we do. But why is it important? I mean, it's the right thing to do. Oftentimes that is not enough to convince people. So if you're not convinced by that, it is good for business. And there's a lot of studies that show that diverse, equitable, and inclusive environments lead to better outcomes. They're more innovative, they're more efficient, they have better revenue, or they do better with revenue. They're also a kind of a risk. It's good for organizations that are risk averse, because we can all look at some very high profile missteps that have been made in advertisement and product development. And you'd think, gosh, who let that go through? Like, was there somebody at the table that said, why are we having this ad, or why are we doing things this way? And maybe they were at the table, but they weren't included. There wasn't real belonging. It wasn't a safe place to actually voice their opinion. So it's important because it's good for business in a number of ways.